Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a while. I've got a couple videos planned for release soon, this being one of them. So I recently got to a point in the game I'm making which I need to implement a key binding system so the player can dynamically change the controls to whatever they feel is comfortable. I know there are some popular assets for this, but a lot of them seemed really complicated and confusing, so I decided to create my own system, and that way I could have more control and flexibility over it. The system I ended up creating is actually super simple, and I was pretty proud of how it came out. So that's the reason I'm making this tutorial, because hopefully some other Gamemaker devs can benefit from it. It's going to be a two-part tutorial. In this part, we're going to make the actual keybinds and implement them in game. And in the second part, we're going to go over how to allow the player to actually change the keybinds dynamically. But before we get into the actual tutorial, I'm going to give a little showcase of what this keybinding system will allow you to achieve. So this is the game I'm working on right now, the platformer game. It's one of two games I'm working on at the moment. So if we go to the menu here, hit options and controls. So, I mean, in this tutorial, I'm not going to be going over the actual UI and stuff like this. This is all things I made for this game in particular. I'm just going to be going over the actual behind the scenes on how to achieve this. So the UI is kind of up to you guys. But so we see we have all the keys here, my movement. So let's say I change this right, to move right. Click on it. Let's change it to G, right? So if I go out here, you guys don't know, but I'm hitting G right now. It's moving them. So that's all working. And as you can see, it's keyboard and controller as well. But yeah, so that's the showcase. Let's get into the tutorial. Before I actually start coding, I'm going to show you guys what I have in this project so far. So it's a pretty bare bones project. I just made it. So let's see, we got two sprites, a player sprite, just 16 by 16, and a background sprite, like this. One object is the player. Go into here. We have two events. The create event is just a simple, setting the speed variable for the movement. And in the step event, we have probably the most basic form of input checking for like movement. If you guys do not know this, then I definitely recommend going and watching a video about basic input before watching this video, because you will need to know about this type of input that Gamemaker has, because we will be utilizing that. And we're also going to be heavily utilizing constructors and structs. So if you don't know those about Gamemaker, there are definitely some videos on YouTube that you can watch about those. I definitely recommend watching any videos about that before watching this tutorial. I know the Gamemaker manual has a very good page about this that explains the structs and constructors pretty well. I'll link that in the description. And so in the room, I just have the player object. So if we run the game right now, it's just going to be very basic, just a directional movement, moving around like that, nothing special, kind of the start of everyone's top-down 2D game. So yeah, so that's what we're starting with. Let's just jump right in. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create the keybind constructors. Okay, so this is how you're going to create the keybind. So I'm going to make a folder called keybind system. You can put it in the folder if you want. You can, sort it however you want, but we're going to make a script, and this is where we're going to write a lot of our functions. So I'm just going to name this input functions, because we're going to have quite a bit of functions in here. And so get rid of this because that's not what it's going to be called. So our first keybind constructor, we're going to have separate keybind constructors for keyboard, mouse wheel. We're even going to do gamepad constructors in this video, so stay tuned. The first one we're going to do is the keyboard constructor. So I'm just going to call it function. I'm going to call it bind KB for keyboard. And these keybind constructors are going to have a name argument and a key argument. And to make constructors, if you didn't know before, you have to put the word constructor after the arguments, and then you can close the brackets like that. So this name is just going to be for us to identify the keybind by. It's going to be a string, and the key is the actual Gamemaker input that you want to check. So if I'm doing like a regular Gamemaker input, like keyboard check, right, VK write, this is what you're going to put in as the key, VK write. Okay, so first let's just set up the variables inside the constructor. So we got bind name equals name. All right, that's pretty straightforward. And then we have key equals underscore key. So like that, that's just assigning our arguments to variables that are going to be held within the struct. Next, we have 3 other variables. These binds are going to keep track of whether they're pressed, held, or released. So we got to give all 3 of those variables. So we'll do pressed equals false to begin with, held equals false to begin with, and released equals false to begin with, all 3. So these are all the variables that are going to be held within this struct. And the only other thing in the struct is going to be 3 different functions that we can call. So if you didn't know that you can put functions inside of a struct, you can, and it's very cool. So I'm going to start with the pressed function. I'm just going to call it pressed fn equals function. This is how you make a local function. And in this function, we're going to check for the pressed. So I'm just going to go pressed equals keyboard check pressed, because Gamemaker has a built-in input check for that. And then we're just going to put in whatever key is in the constructor for this. So it's very dynamic. And this is kind of how we're going to do all 3 of the functions. So you can copy this, paste, paste. The second one will be held fn for held, and we'll do held equals keyboard check, not pressed, but just keyboard check. That's what checks if the key is down. And then finally, we're going to have released fn equals function, and then released equals keyboard check, not pressed, but released, like that. And they're all using the same key. So if we wanted to call these from an outside object, let's say this object was called, let's say we made a keybind object like me equals new bind KB, and then we give it a name and a key like this. We could just call me dot pressed function to update, to call this and update the pressed variable inside the struct. So very helpful. And before we go on and create the keybinds for mouse and mouse wheel and gamepad and stuff like that, we're just going to keep it simple. We're going to stick with the keyboard, and I'm going to show you how to actually implement it in game before we create the other keybinds. So without further ado, let's get out of this script, and we're going to create a new object. This new object is going to be called obj input. Okay. So a couple things. I usually mark this object as persistent because this is going to handle all of the input checking and stuff like that. So you want that to stick around for your whole game. So usually I would put it in an like a beginning initialization room and just have it persistent throughout the whole game. So let's just add a create event here. And the first thing we're going to do is add a empty array. So called keybinds equals empty array. So you can make an empty array like this. You can also do it like this and just make it an array of size 0. I like doing it this way. It just seems easier. So whatever you like though. So keybinds equals empty array. And that's all we're going to do for now because we don't have the necessary things to check for input and stuff like that. So first, we're going to figure out how to populate this array with actual keybinds. So for that, we have to make another script. We're going to call this script keybinds. So we're going to have, there's actually going to be 2 functions in here, but the first one is going to be called initialize keybinds. and no arguments. This is where we're going to create all of the keybinds, and it's going to populate that array with these keybinds. So we're going to go with obj input, so we're doing it inside of that object. Keybinds, which is the array we just created, equals, and you can create an array like this and give it a bunch of values like this, but you can also spread it out across multiple lines, for instance like this, and have the values on separate lines like that. And that's what we're going to do. So each of these lines is going to be a keybind. So let's just make a couple. Let's make 4 for the different directions we're moving in the player. So the first one we'll do keybinds. The first element in the array is going to be new bind. You can see it shows up there because we made it, KB. We'll give it a name. Let's say move right. And the key will be VK right. We'll do right arrow key. So comma. You can't do it semicolon because you're initializing an array right now, so it doesn't work. You have to do comma to separate the elements in the array. So new bind KB, and you can just kind of copy and paste if you want. This is going to be VK left, and I'm just going to copy and paste this. We'll do one for up and one for down, and just switch the keys. Just like that. Okay, so these are our keybinds. And if we call this function, it's going to initialize this array with these keybinds. So why don't we go back into the input object, and right after we make this empty array, we're going to call that function and just populate that array. Perfect. So once we call this, Gamemaker has a garbage collector that will collect structs if it senses that they're not being used anymore. So one thing we should do is make a cleanup event in the input object, because we don't want all these structs to hang around. It can cause memory issues and stuff like that. So I would just set this keybinds array back to empty so it knows we're not using the keybinds that are inside of that anymore. Perfect. So that's all we need to do right now in the input object, because we don't have a way to update the input, which we're going to want to do every step. So let's make a function that will loop through the keybinds and update the input so we get accurate actual input readings. So go back to script input functions where we made our keybind. Let's press enter a couple times, leave some space for the other keybinds we're going to make, and just make a function, call it input update, no arguments. And this is going to be similar to initializing keybinds, where we're going to do it with the input object. So with obj input. And so now we're just going to create a for loop and loop through the keybinds and just call their pressed function, held function, and release function just to update them all so the variables are accurate. So we'll create a for loop. Var I equals 0, I is less than array length keybinds. So it's just going to loop through the keybinds array, plus plus. Perfect. And inside the for loop, we're just going to call the individual functions for the selected keybinds. So keybinds I dot pressed, or no, we're going to call the held function first, and then keybinds. That's important for later. When we get to the gamepad inputs, I'll explain why. But call the held function first, and then you can call keybinds I dot pressed function and keybinds I dot released function. Cool. So that will literally check for input when we call this function for all the keybinds. So awesome. Let's go back to our input object and create a step event. And we're just going to call this function in the step event, input update. Perfect. So every step, this input is going to run through the keybinds and update all of their checks to make sure the variables inside the structs are accurate. It's kind of like checking for a key every step. Now, in order for, let's say the player wants to check if a certain key is pressed, right? We don't have functions to check if a keybind is pressed, released, or held. So we need to make those separate functions, which are fairly easy. So go into your script input functions, and under the input update, we're going to make a function. Call it function input check pressed, and we're going to have one argument, which is name. So this is where the name and the keybind comes in. You're going to input a name into this function, and it's going to find which keybind has that name and then check if it's pressed. So inside this function, we are again going to do it with obj input, and we're going to do a for loop again. So same as before, var I equals 0, I is less than array length keybinds, and then I plus plus. And so now we just need to check if the current keybind has the same name that we're looking for. So we go if keybinds I dot bind name, because that's the variable we stored up here as the name, bind name, is equal to name, which is the argument that we provided. So if it is equal, then we're just going to return the pressed variable for that keybind, because we're updating this every step, so it knows if it's pressed every step, it knows if it's released, it knows if it's held. So now we just need to return the variable, so it's going to return true or false whether it's pressed or not. And this goes for the other functions too. So we can just copy and paste this input, and we'll do this one is input check held. But instead of returning the pressed variable, we just return the held variable. And then same for released. Input check released, and then return the released variable. Perfect. So now we can actually do input checks. So we could just go into the player here, and when he's moving right, we can just call our keybind and go input check held and then move right, which is what the name that we gave our moving right keybind. But this inside this function is a for loop, and if we had like tons of different objects calling this function to check different keys and stuff, it would, it's going to cause kind of a performance impact if you have a lot of different ones calling it. So instead, what I like to do here, I'll go back, replace this with the old one. What I like to do is create global variables that are only checked once every step. So multiple objects aren't checking them every step. It just saves a little bit of performance. So I'll show you how to do it. In script keybinds, we're going to make the second function that goes in the script. Function keybindings. That's what I call it. I'm sure there's a better name for it, but that's what I've just always called it. So what I'm going to do is just create global variables for each of the keybinds that I've created. So I have 4 keybinds. So I'm going to go global.move right, I'll call it that, equals input check held move right, because that is, you look in here, that's the name we selected. And for moving, we want them to hold the key, right? We're not checking if it's pressed or released. So I did input check held. Okay. And then we're just going to basically do this for all of them. And it depends on like what your keybind is for. You can do pressed, released, they all work. But just for movement, I got to make it so it's held, so that it actually works. So I'll do move right, left, up, and down, and then change the names over here to what they should be so that they match up. And so once this is done, we just need to call this function after we get the input update every step. So go into your obj input, into the step event. So this is where we're calling input update every step. And right after it, you can just call the key binding, so we're updating those global variables. And now, if we go into the player, instead of having to call that function for every single object that wants to do something, we just see what the global variable is held. So we do global.move right. And these global variables, like any object, can check them. So it makes it really easy and saves a lot of performance. So global.move up. And if we did this correctly, we run the game, this should work just as it was before, except it's using the key binding system now. And looks like I got an error. It says move right, not set before reading it. Okay, I see what's going on. So the player is running this line of code trying to check the global variable before the input object is running this function to actually set those. So we're going to have to run this function right in the beginning after we initialize the key bindings just once, so we can initialize those global variables. And now if we run it, it should work. Okay, looks like we got another error. Okay, I see what the problem is. It's that we didn't put the input object in the room. Very silly mistake. So just drag that on in there. And now if we run the game, it should work exactly as it was in the beginning, except now it's utilizing the keybind system that we made. Awesome. So let's just run a test real quick. You guys can't see it. I'm using the arrow keys right now. So I just want to run a test to see if we can change some of this stuff. So let's go to script keybinds, where we initialize our keybinds. You don't need to mess with key bindings, just where we made the actual keybind structs here. And let's change some of the keys. Let's change this VK right. Let's go from the arrow keys to WASD. So right would be D, in which we got to put ord D, like that. That's how you do a letter input check. And so let's change all these. Let's go left is A, up is W, and down is S. So now this should change in game. And yeah, I'm using WASD right now and it's working perfectly. So awesome. So the keybind structs are working. So the last thing we need to do in this video is create the other keybind structs. So now we can only make keybinds that are for the keyboard buttons. So now go into your script input functions and we're going to make a couple other keybinds. So they all work relatively the same. They all have the same function names because that allows us to call the function in all of them regardless of what type they are. So we can just copy and paste the keyboard keybind and let's make a mouse button keybind. So we're gonna call this bind MB for mouse button instead of keyboard. And it's gonna be the same arguments, name, key, same here, pressed equals false, held equals false, released equals false. And the functions, inside the functions is the only thing we're gonna change. So pressed is gonna equal mouse check button pressed. These are the Gamemaker inbuilt input functions. And then we're just gonna put the key in there. Awesome. And same thing down here. Held is just gonna be mouse check button key. And then for released, it's gonna be mouse check button released key. Looks good. That's all we need for the mouse button. So very easy. They're all very similar. So next we're gonna make one that's a little bit different. It's for the mouse wheel, because these mouse buttons, this can go for like the left mouse button, the right mouse button, and the middle mouse button, like clicking in your mouse wheel. But this is not going to cover the mouse wheel scrolling. So we can do that by making another one. And so I'll call this one bind MW for mouse wheel. And this is a little bit different. Instead of providing a key, we're going to provide a direction in which to we want to check the scrolling. If we want to scroll up, it's going to be negative. If we want to scroll down, it's going to be positive. So we can put a -1 or +1 in there when we're making the keybind. And then we're just going to do direction equals sign dir, just to make sure it's -1 or 1. We do the sign here. So yeah, so down here, we got to do an if statement in here now instead of just the regular input functions, because mouse wheel you can either check mouse wheel down like that or mouse wheel up like that. So we have to do an if statement to figure out what direction we should do it. So in here, you can get rid of these mouse checks. And in the pressed function, we're going to do if dir is less than 0. Then we're going to check if it's less than 0, then that means we're going up. So we're going to check pressed equals mouse wheel up. So it's going to return true or false, whether the mouse wheel is going up on that step. And then else if dir is greater than 0, which is if it's like 1, then it's going down. So pressed equals mouse wheel down. And else, which in this case, means it's 0 for any reason, like maybe if you put in the direction wrong when you were making the keybind, then we just got to set pressed to false, because like there's nothing you can really do. It's just an error on your part if you make the keybind and put 0 in for the direction. So nothing will be happening, nothing will be checking. And then for the held function and release function, they're actually pretty easy for the mouse wheel, because if you think about it, you can't hold a mouse wheel. It's a different, like the mouse wheel button if you're clicking it in, but that's covered by the mouse button up here. You can't actually hold a mouse wheel, you just scroll it. You know what I'm saying? So held is always going to be equal to false, and same for release, it's always going to be equal to false, because if you can't hold a mouse wheel, you can't release a mouse wheel. So that is the mouse wheel constructor. And so that's all we need if you're just making a keyboard game. We're going to also utilize the gamepad inputs in a second here. But before we do that, let's just test out these mouse constructors. So go into your script keybinds, into your initialize keybinds function, and just change like 1 or 2 of these to, instead of being a keyboard bind, I'm going to change my moving up, get rid of that, and make it a bind MB, which is mouse button. I'll still call it move up, so the global function, the global variables will still check the right one. And I'm going to put MB left in here. So now if I hold the left mouse button down, I should be moving up with my player. Let's go try it out. And yeah, it's working. It's no longer W, it is left mouse button. Awesome. It works great. All right, so now that we tested that out, I'll put this back to what it was before and change it back to a keyboard struct. Cool. So now that works, and you can test out the mouse wheel too, that'll work as well. Now we can start on the gamepad. So add some space right here. There is 2 gamepad keybind constructors. One is for a gamepad button, and the other is for a gamepad axes for the joysticks. So first we'll do the button because it's easier. It's the most similar to the keyboard. So you can just copy and paste your keyboard bind function, and we'll call it gamepad button. So GPB, bind GPB. And this is all going to be the same, the name, the key. And for a key, you're going to put in like GP face 1 or something like that. And you have these variables. And so inside the functions, instead of doing keyboard check, you're going to be doing gamepad button check. and it's gonna want you to put in a device. I'm just gonna put in 0, but for your game, you might want to check what device is connected, and it's fairly easy to do. There's a lot of videos on YouTube explaining how to do it, so I'm not gonna go through that right now. But for me, I'm just gonna put in 0 because my gamepad is connected to 0. And so yeah, this will do it. You just put in the key there, and same for down here. You just go gamepad button check 0 key. My bad. Up here it should be gamepad button check pressed, because this is a pressed function. And then this is just gamepad button check, and down here should be gamepad button check released. And I'm just gonna do 0 and key. So that is the gamepad button. And so if you want to try that out, you can. I'll try it out right now. Connect to my gamepad. And so I'm going to go into script keybinds right here, into my initialize keybinds function. I'm going to change these to gamepad inputs. So we'll go bind GPB, move right, and we'll change the key to GP pad. Oh, that's what it is. GP pad R, which is for the D-pad. It's the right key on the D-pad. That's what that is. And then yeah, I'll just change all of these. So I'll go through here. I'll delete these. Okay. So now if I pull out my gamepad and get into the game, I should be able to move with the D-pad. So yeah, my keyboard's not working anymore, but with the D-pad, I am moving around right now. So awesome. The gamepad button keybinds are working, and hopefully for you guys, it's all working as well. And now the last keybind to add is going to be the gamepad axes. So for the joysticks. So we're going to add a new function right here. Function bind GPA for gamepad axes. Give it a name, and it's going to be different arguments for this one. It's going to be axes and then value. So it's fairly similar to the other ones. We're going to set the bind name here like we did for all the others. We're going to set the axes, so it's a little bit different here. And if you know how Gamemaker gamepad input works, which you should if you're watching this video, then you know why we're doing it this way. So value equals value. So after that, we just have our basic pressed, held, and released variables. There's actually one more variable that we need here, and I call it last held. This is going to keep track of what if it was held the last step. So not the current step, but the last step. And the reason I do this is because Gamemaker doesn't have any built-in functions for checking if a gamepad axis was like in quotations pressed, because a lot of times when you're making UI for gamepads where they're like clicking through buttons with the axes, it's kind of a pain to not make it so that when you flick the stick, it goes through like a bunch of different buttons, because there's no way to check if it was just if the axis was just moved that step. So my keybind system that I've made right here allows us to check if the axis is, I call it pressed, but it's not actually the joystick pressed down. It's just checking if that step was the step that you moved the joystick to the right value. So it's very helpful for UI and stuff like that, and whatever you might need for your joystick inputs. So our pressed function is going to be very simple. Pressed fn. Make sure you name it the same as the other ones. Equals function. And we're pretty much just checking if it wasn't held last step, but now it is held. That means it was pressed on this step, kind of. So we're just going to go if last held is equal to false and held is equal to true. Then pressed equals true. and else pressed equals false. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if I did a very good job at explaining it, but if you've ever tried to go through, you know, UI or making menu systems with the Gamepad in Gamemaker, you'll know what I'm talking about. So it's going to help you in the long run. And then after this, we make our held function, and this is where we actually do a check. So before we actually set the new held variable, we're going to do last held equals held. And, you know, I said earlier, there's a reason why we call the held function first. This is why, for the gamepad axes, because this needs to be set, this last held, in order for this pressed function and release function to work, because it's going to be setting the last held and held. So now, as you see up here, we're given a value and an axis. So the way I do it is, if the value is less than 0, we're going to check if we want it. It's kind of hard without visualizing a gamepad, but if the value is less than 0, the joystick's going to the left. So we want it to be less than that value, and then vice versa the other way. If the value is greater than 0, the joystick's going to the right, so we want the value of the joystick to be greater than that value that we've given it here. So it's going to be an if statement here. We're going to go if value is less than 0. Whoops, I should not put an underscore because we're just working with this variable right here. If value is less than 0, then we're going to check held equals gamepad axis value, and you put in your number, and then axis index, which is going to be the axis that we're going to give to the keybind, and we're checking if this is going to be less than the value that we've set for this, because it's less than 0. And then we're going to go else if value is greater than 0. We do the exact opposite. Held equals gamepad axis value, 0 axis is greater than value. And then else if value is equal to 0. We don't actually have to put an if there, because if it got past the others, then it means it's 0. And we're just going to put held equals false, because the value should not be 0. It's going to make it so this is always triggering pretty much. So this is just kind of like a safe thing to avoid that. And then the released function is pretty much the same as the press function, just goes the other way. So if last held is equal to true, so if it was held last step and it's not held anymore, which is last held is equal to true and held is equal to false, then that means released equals true. Else released equals false. Perfect. So that is the gamepad axis keybind. It's probably the most complicated one, but hopefully you guys got through that and understand it correctly. So let's try it out. To our initialize keybinds function, and let's change this. Let's go new GPA instead of GPB, and we have to give it an axis. So I'll go GP, I'm going to do the left analog stick, so GP axis L, and then it's horizontal for move right, so LH. And then the value, I want it to be greater than 0.5 is where I usually do. So you have to go at least halfway to the end of the joystick like threshold. So that's good for that. And then moving left, it's going to be same axis. It's the horizontal axis on the left stick, but we're going to go negative 0.5 because it's going left. And then we can just copy those. And for up and down, we have to change the axis because we're going to be working with the vertical axis. So axis left still, but it's going to be V now because it's the vertical. And moving up is negative 0.5, and moving down is 0.5. So if I run the game right now, I got my gamepad connected. Yep, and I'm moving around with the joystick right now, and it's working. perfectly. Awesome. So that is all the keybinds that you probably will need, unless you have some weird controller. But this should work with all controllers. This should work with the Steam Deck controller, as well as all keyboard buttons and mouse buttons. So yeah, I'm pretty proud of the system. That is all I have planned for the first part of the tutorial. So that was just creating the keybinds and actually implementing them in game. And so in the second part, we're going to be going through how to allow the player to change them. So thank you guys for tuning in. If you liked the video, please leave a like, maybe a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next one.